Near the southern tip of Vancouver Island, 25 minutes from downtown Victoria, sits a jewel of the Edwardian era, an exquisitely designed and maintained Japanese garden. The desire to learn more about the man who created this garden took Royal Roads University gardener and horticultural therapist Paul Allison on a remarkable journey of discovery. In Japan, cranes symbolize longevity. These stone cranes, brought from Japan a century ago by a little-known Japanese gardener, have seen this garden and the estate that surrounds it through 100 years of vibrant life. Hatley Park in Victoria, British Columbia, is one of the few intact Edwardian estates left in Canada. Now a National Historic Site and home to Royal Roads University, Hatley Park boasts a 100-year-old replica of a 15th century castle and some of the most beautifully preserved early 20th century gardens in Canada. There's a rose garden and an Italian garden, but for Paul Allison, the real gem is the authentic Japanese garden.
This is kind of a secret garden here at Royal Roads in Hatley Park. This is what we call a gardener's garden.
For Paul, the secret garden has taken on a special significance. For 6 months of the year, he's a gardener at Royal Roads, but a gardener who wears many hats.
When people ask me what I am, if I mention a Latin name, they think, well, you must be a botanist. If I do a healing garden design, then they think I'm a landscape architect. If I'm doing research, then they think I'm a professor. If I'm doing workshops, then I'm a teacher and a lecturer. So because it's kind of complicated to talk to people about the work that I do in one sentence, I normally end up that I'm just a gardener.
Gardening has taken Paul halfway around the world, from his native England to Western Canada and Japan. Both journey and career began in his parents' home in Cornwall.
Both my father and my mother were keen gardeners. In fact, my grandfather on my father's side was a keen gardener too. And my mother still is active in the gardening world. In fact, she works at a garden centre now at the age of 71.
During his formal training in England, inclination grew into avocation.
I really connected to the plant world when I was at Oxford Botanical Gardens. It's a very old botanical garden, 1610, and in the 5 acres there we had more plants in that 5 acres than anywhere else in the world, so it's like a true Garden of Eden. Actually, I kind of leapt over the garden wall, so to speak, as well, and realized that the whole planet is a garden. When I emigrated to Canada, I thought, well, it's time to start something new. And that's when I really became involved in horticultural therapy and the people-plant connection. As Hippocrates, the father of medicine, said, healing is a matter of time, but it's also a matter of opportunity. So bringing in the plant world and nature is bringing in the opportunity to heal in nursing homes, in our schools, and in our institutions.
The discipline of horticultural therapy is based on the theory that millions of years of evolution have linked our nervous systems to the environment.
Our DNA is programmed for nature and greenery and the plant world. And without it, it almost goes into shock. So we're always trying to connect back to that 3 million years of human evolution of our nervous system with the environment. Green is a balanced color, it's harmonious, so that when our eyes look at it, we relax. And just the moments to catch your breath and to empty yourself so that you can receive more things.
In 25 years of horticultural therapy, Paul has worked with disadvantaged youth, AIDS patients, and people with Alzheimer's. The elderly in particular seem to respond to the natural power of a garden.
When I've worked in healthcare facilities, particularly senior homes, my gardening program is the most popular of all the activities that people do, particularly with the elderly males.
In 1992, Paul's father passed away in Cornwall. With the loss came the realization that his father had been a silent, guiding hand throughout his career.
If your father recognizes the core of you, it really kind of adds a lot to your life and a framework and a structure and like the foundation of your life when your own father and your own parents recognize the work that you do.
Recreating Eden will return with more Paul Allison. When his father died in 1992, horticultural therapy and the connection we share with the environment became personal for Paul Allison.
As part of my grieving process, I used to come to Royal Road's gardens, and particularly the Japanese garden, and I found it very restorative, the tranquility. And I guess that's why I started to become involved in finding out and researching about this garden, because if it's affecting me this way, I wanted to know how I could do the same thing in designing other gardens.
Paul's therapeutic gardens now incorporate elements of Japanese garden design. This garden at the Royal Jubilee Hospital in Victoria, co-designed with Takashi Fujimura, even has a suikinkutsu, an underground water harp chamber that's said to have therapeutic powers. It's the first of its kind in Canada.
So underneath here is a vase that was built in Kyoto, about this shape, this size and shape. And around that are stones placed around it to make an echo chamber. So when the water falls down into the vase, it makes this ding dong, ding, 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 dong sound.
Paul's love affair with Japan began in earnest 8 years ago, when he was invited by the Japanese Greenery Association to lecture in Japan. Talking to Japanese gardeners gave him a better understanding of their culture and the myths surrounding it.
If you asked Western people about Japanese gardens, and you asked them, give me 3 words that describe a Japanese garden, they'll say tranquil, sanctuary, nature. If you ask a Japanese person about Japanese gardens, they'll say rocks, pine tree, bridges. Japanese people talk about what the gardens are or what are in them, whereas Westerners tend to romanticize about Japanese gardens a lot more. And it's that kind of romanticism or viewpoint of a Japanese garden being healing that I try to incorporate in my designs. The elements of a Japanese garden are fairly familiar elements, that you have water, either in the form of a pond or a stream or a waterfall, which represents the ocean. You have stones, large stones, placed very carefully, that represent mountains or islands. And then you have the plant material themselves and other hard construction features like bridges, etc. The arched bridge is, common icon of Japanese gardens. But it's more the curves and the little bit of imperfection and the little bit of chaos that is very important for Japanese gardens. Like they'll carefully rake up all those maple leaves, but then select a few maple leaves to put back on the path again to make it look like it's those leaves have just fallen. What affects me in the Japanese gardens compared to, say, the Italian garden that we have here is the naturalness of it. You know, Italian gardens tend to be very formal, very dominated and controlled by man. Japanese gardens can be done the same way with the clipping of hedges and pruning things, but it's the simplicity of nature that you're trying to replicate and the symbolism that each part of that garden represents in one's psyche and one's mind.
Paul's love for Japanese culture brought an unexpected turn in his life when he met his future wife.
We didn't meet in a garden, unfortunately. We met in an internet cafe in my hometown in Japan.
I was sitting at an internet cafe typing away on my computer, and suddenly it all turned to Japanese.
I was happened to be sitting next to him, and he suddenly talked to me how to fix all the characters on his display from from Japanese to English.
And she was kind enough to help me, and I thanked her for it, and I invited her for a cup of coffee, and 8 years later we married.
Japan is now Paul's second home for 6 months of the year. In gardening, it's his spiritual home.
One particular Zen monk that does Japanese gardens said to me, says, "Paul, you're actually bringing Japanese gardens back to me. I'm like a mirror to him of what Japanese gardens are, because sometimes we forget what they are and what the meaning of the gardens are." So my inquisitiveness and kind of out-of-the-box viewing of Japanese gardens gives them another perspective, kind of from a Western viewpoint of what their gardens are.
When Paul shows his serious interest and passion about the garden, Japanese people just love it. And Japanese people sometimes describe Paul as a person who has a true Japanese soul rather than Japanese.
As Paul's knowledge of Japanese culture grew, he realized that a mystery lay literally under his feet. This elegant garden had been commissioned by Hatley Park's original owner, coal baron, politician and fashionable Edwardian James Dunsmuir. And it's his name that's usually associated with it. But of the man who actually designed it, Isaburo Kishida, Paul knew nothing.
I first came to this garden about 20 years ago, and ironically about 8 years ago I became a gardener here at Royal Roads, and everybody knows the Dunsmuirs and the Bouchard families and the people that own the gardens, but I wanted to do research, because I'm a gardener myself, on the gardener who actually created this garden.
All Paul had to go on was the name Isaburo Kishida, and as he would discover, that's almost all anyone knew about the creator of the first Japanese gardens in Canada. We'll be right back with more Recreating Eden. With the help of a small research grant, Paul Allison began digging into the mystery surrounding the creation of the Japanese gardens at Royal Roads University and its designer, Isaburo Kishida.
When I started doing research on Kishida, I realized that I'd have to go back in time quite considerably to see if I could find primary documents that were, of that time, because there was a lot of anecdotal information that was contradictory. So I started to dig around in the archives.
Finding Mr. Kishida was a little bit like starting to uncover a heritage garden. You know you're going to find something if you slowly peel away the layers, but you're not sure what it is.
Gradually, a story emerged. In 1907, at the request of his son Yoshijiro, the 65-year-old Kishida made the arduous journey from Japan to Victoria to design a Japanese tea garden in Esquimalt Gorge Park.
Yoshitaro, Kishida's son, had put his business plan into the BC Electric Railway Company, who owned the Gorge Park, and they wanted to use it as a tourist destination back in 1907.
The tea garden was a smashing success. In the first 3 days, 5,000 people, the equivalent of the population of Victoria, toured Kishida's garden.
The president of the BC Electric Railway Company, who owned the Gorge Park Gardens, was so impressed with the Japanese gardens that he said, "Why don't you create some for my own private home?" And it was actually after those were built that he had a garden party, and some of the people he invited were Laura Dunsmuir and Jenny Bouchard. And it was that day that they decided, as they looked around at that garden party, that they too wanted to have a Japanese-style tea garden. And over the couple of years remaining years that Isaburo Kishida was here, he created both the Japanese gardens at the Royal Roads here, and also created the Japanese garden at Bouchard's.
As Paul slowly learned more about Kishida's history, one element of the story felt very familiar.
I think one of the influences goes back to that it was a father-son relationship. I had a very strong relationship with my father. He certainly has influenced me to get into gardening. He said I was green before everybody else became green. And so the interesting relationship between Kishida and his son fascinated me even more.
One treasure Paul unearthed from the Yokohama archives was a century-old catalog from the Yokohama nursery where Kishida was employed as a designer.
I'm leaning against one of the Yokohama nursery's cherries that came about 100 years ago. The garden that Kishida designed here was mainly from materials from that catalog. And interestingly enough, the Yokohama catalog was one of the influential catalogs for your stone lanterns, your cherry trees, your maples. That's how it spread across the West.
The catalog's influence is still with us today. You can see it in gardens like the Takata Gardens, named after the family that operated the tea garden at Gorge Park until 1942.
This garden was built fairly recently in the last 5 years, and it's a beautiful Japanese garden right in the heart of Victoria here. Within this garden you've got a nice strolling garden and also a Zen garden, probably one of the very few that are on the west coast of Canada.
Unfortunately, Kishida's original tea garden at the Gorge is gone. It flourished for decades, but fell victim to vandals after World War II. To celebrate the 100th anniversary of Kishida's arrival in Canada, the town of Esquimalt is planning to rebuild the garden in its original location.
Isaburo Kishida has left an amazing legacy of gardens for this area and is the main man and the person responsible for developing all these Japanese gardens on the west coast. And of course has now influenced a lot of other Japanese-style gardens throughout North America.
Recreating Eden will return with the conclusion of Paul Allison.
So welcome Takayasa-san to Royal Roads University and the beautiful gardens of your great-grandfather. It's a pleasure to see you. Hi, this is my beautiful wife Makiko Nishida.
On a brilliant September morning, Paul Allison's 6-year quest takes an extraordinary turn as he brings the garden back to its creator. in the person of Isaburo Kishida's great-grandson.
When Hirano-san from Yokohama Archives put on the website about Isaburo Kishida and my research 2 years ago, I didn't think that we were actually going to get a response back. But on April the 19th, 2007, we received an email from Mr. Take-san. And lo and behold, it was the same date, April the 19th, 1907, that Isaburo Kishida arrived in Victoria.
もう影響もその先祖を発見する
When I tried to research my family history, I couldn't find anything in Japan. When I discovered Paul, he sent me a lot of information that was instrumental in beginning my research. It's true, he was the starting point for learning about my family.
本当の話です。日本では全くわからない。
For me personally, it connects the dots. It makes it very real when I'm meeting the family members that really my research has been trying to discover. And it puts a personal face on this whole story.
In his work, Paul is adding to the rich history of Japanese culture in British Columbia, writing a new chapter in a book that was started a century ago by his inspiration, Isaburo Kishida.
I was giving a lecture called The Anatomy of a Healing Garden to a group of medical professionals. And after I gave my lecture, I was approached by Dr. William Thomas, who came up to me and said, "Paul, the work you're doing is very important." And he says, you know, surgery and drugs does not help with the three major problems in our society, which is loneliness, depression, and boredom. It's those things that are really affect our health more than even our disease. We know that it lowers our immunity if we feel lonely, depressed, and bored. So that's where gardening and this connection with the plant world can really help.
By helping us rediscover our connection with the earth and with our past, Paul Allison is creating his own legacy, one that will resonate for years to come.
One of my favorite poems is from the haiku poet Basho from Japan, who wrote a very simple haiku saying, "When the temple bell stops, the sound keeps coming out of the flowers."